The story takes place in Sandpoint, Idaho, but we begin in Reno, Nevada. In February of 1994, Paul Gruber's daughter Shelley phones her father's neighbor Kathy, with great concern telling her that she's been trying to reach her father, and every time she calls her father there is a voice recording that is not her father's voice. One of the messages that Shelley leaves on the voice recorder is about her kid's birthday, and soon after this message was left, Shelley received a birthday card with a check which is out of character for her father. Shelley at this point knew something was wrong, and with the persuasion of Kathy, her father's neighbor, Shelley would phone the police and ask them to do a wellness check. When the local police arrived, it would appear that no one has lived at Paul's house for quite some time. Paul Gruber was a retired teacher out of the Reno, Nevada area. Paul was known to be the life of the party, an extrovert, very easygoing, and with every picture with Paul in it, he would always have a great big smile on his face. Paul early in life made some great investments, so he was quite wealthy and would retire early and move to Sandpoint, Idaho. Sandpoint is a postcard town with beautiful mountains and lakes, and it was a great place to raise a family. Paul would have a beautiful house built right off of Muskrat Lake Road. Paul was an outdoorsy kind of person and would fit right into his new location. He would go on hikes and would go fishing. With Sandpoint as his new home, the sky was the limit. Paul was a people person, and with meeting new people, he was always known to be an open book. Paul was also known to travel. He was kind of a free spirit. He would always just go at the drop of a hat. At this point in Paul's life, he had a son and a daughter, and 2 grandkids. Paul was really close to his daughter, Shelley, and her kids. He was a very hands-on grandfather. Paul would tell his neighbor that he was going to Reno to see his daughter and grandkids for the holiday. At this point, Paul would return home, and Shelley was unable to reach her father. Shelley was concerned with the lack of communication from her father, and after the police did a wellness check and nothing seemed to be out of place, Shelley would insist that the handwriting was not her father's, and that her father would never leave on a trip without letting her know where he was going. With the police having some suspicion of the state of Paul's home, and with the insistence of Paul's daughter, the police would have Shelley's kid's birthday card and check analyzed by a handwriting expert to determine if the handwriting was Paul's or not. The handwriting expert would determine that the handwriting was a match. With that being said, the police still had suspicion, because when they did the wellness check, Paul's new Ford pickup was nowhere to be found, so the police would put out a bolo. Just a short amount of time would pass, and Paul's truck would be found in Coeur d'Alene, which was about an hour and 15 minutes from Paul's house. When the police arrived, it would appear that Paul's truck was abandoned by a professional. When the police did their forensic examination, there were no fingerprints found anywhere, and this would raise alarms with the police. With Paul missing and his truck being found about an hour away from Paul's home, the police would decide to launch a full investigation of Paul's home. It's March 1st, 1994. It has been 2 months since Paul Gruber has been reported missing. The police have had no luck in the case of the whereabouts of Paul. With Sandpoint being such a small town, the community was concerned. The Bonner County Sheriff's Office was the first to do the wellness check and saw nothing suspicious. So a second search is done of Paul's home and nothing is found. So at this point, the local police have no evidence of foul play, just suspicious activities. With nothing to be found at Paul's home, the police turn their attention to Paul's bank account. With Paul being missing from the time he returned from Reno, there were withdrawals from Paul's bank account from the ATM. The local police notified Shelley, and she tells them her father did not like to use ATMs. And with this being 94 and in a small town, there were no cameras on the ATM. At this point, all the police have is an abandoned truck that's wiped and a home that shows no signs of foul play. So Shelley takes it into her own hands and calls the local post office and explains the situation to the postmaster and asks if her father's mail is piling up. The postmaster informs her that Paul's mail is being picked up on a regular basis. Shelley informs the local police of this break, and they set up cameras at Paul's mailbox, and with luck the man that was picking up Paul's mail would do so right in front of the camera. With Sandpoint being such a small town, everyone knows everyone. So with the low-quality image being shown to the locals, the name Daryl Cule would start to be mentioned. Daryl Cule was an easily identifiable man. He was about 6'1" or 6'2", with an athletic build, full head of hair, and a light mustache. Daryl was married and had 8 kids, and lived on the outer reaches of Bonner County, and was a member of the Church of the Latter-day Saints. With word reaching Daryl, he would come into the police station to be interviewed on his own volition. Daryl would explain he has been working for Paul Gruber as a handyman and taking care of his house while he was on vacation. Daryl would say that Paul was on vacation in Canada. This would raise the suspicion of the police because Paul would never leave without notifying his family. The officer would ask Daryl why he has been picking up Paul's mail. Daryl would say Paul asked him to pick up his mail while he was gone. Daryl was presented with a picture of Paul Gruber and immediately would say that the man in the picture was not the man he had been working for. The police would bring in a sketch artist, and Daryl would provide the information to the artist, and this is the description that he gave. The police would release the picture of the suspect that Daryl had given them, seeking the help of the locals because the person of interest was a potential threat to the community. With the imposter on everyone's mind, the focus was off of Daryl, and the talk of the town was all about the whereabouts of Paul and his imposter. With the police exhausting all avenues to find the imposter, they would turn their attention back to Paul's home. It's now April 17th, 1994, and it's the 3rd time that Paul's home would be searched from top to bottom, and the outside of the home would be searched as well. As the detectives searched the home, there would be a rug that just seemed out of place. With further investigation of the rug, they realized that it was glued in place. After the rug is pulled up, there would seem to be a bullet trail on the ground, and with the suspicion of the police, they would spray luminol down, and moments later, there would be a blood stain almost same shape as the rug. The police would pull up the floorboards and find a pool of blood and do a DNA test that would come back as positive for Paul Gruber. This would thrust the investigation into high gear because of the amount of blood left at the scene would indicate that the police are now looking for a body. The police would bring in cadaver dogs to try and locate Paul's body. The cadaver dogs would search every inch of Paul's home and would find nothing to indicate a dead body. At this point, with no body found, the police would have to regroup and set up a timetable of Paul's whereabouts. They know the last anyone spoke to him was around Christmas. With this, the police would find checks that were written by Paul out to Pacific Resources and NLM Distributing. And with further digging, the police would find the owner of these companies to be Daryl Cule. The police would bring Daryl in for another interview, and Daryl would claim that the imposter would be the person that wrote him the checks. Daryl also claimed that he was paying Paul's bills while he was on vacation. With the insistence of Shelley, another handwriting expert would be brought in. With the help of Mr. Floberg, a handwriting comparison was done, and this time it was determined that the handwriting was not a match. Mr. Floberg would notice the hesitations in the handwriting, which would indicate a person trying to match the handwriting of Paul. With the signature looking close to Paul's, Mr. Floberg would look at the numbers on the check, which were far off from Paul's handwriting. Mr. Floberg would be given some of Daryl Cule's checks that he had written for his construction company, and would determine the handwriting of Daryl Cule to be a match for the person writing the check in Paul's name. With this new evidence, the police would start to build a case against Daryl Cule, but they were having trouble finding anyone that knew of Paul and Daryl knowing each other. The police would reach out to a friend of Paul's that lived in Reno when they heard that Paul was known for videotaping his new home and surrounding areas in Sandpoint. That friend's name was Bob Fullerton, and he would recall Paul showing him some tapes where Paul was filming his landscape and would focus the camera for about 4 seconds on what Paul would call his caretaker. Bob would say that he could possibly pick this person out of a lineup. The police would present Bob with a photo lineup, and almost immediately Bob would pick out Daryl. With Daryl's story falling apart, he would move his whole family out of the state to Washington. The local prosecutor would tell the lead detective that they could charge Daryl but may not get a conviction due to there being no body. August 1995, Paul Gruber has been missing for 21 months, and with the cost of the investigation looming over the local police, they would decide to search Paul's home one last time. As the lead detective starts speaking about the last search they would do of Paul's, one of the officers would ask if the detective was talking about Paul Gruber, because this particular officer helped build Paul Gruber's house. The officer's name was Chuck Miner, and Chuck would be asked to do a walkthrough of Paul's home. And about 20 minutes into the search, Chuck would notice something was off. Chuck was an electrician and would say something has changed down here. There was an extension cord going from the upstairs to the basement crawl space, so the officer would follow it down and would be led to a portion of the crawl space that had some exposed dirt with a soft spot. The officers would begin to dig with their hands, and not too far down, they would be greeted by the smell of decomposing flesh. The police would do a full excavation of the site, and 28 inches down, they would find Paul's body, wrapped in a waterbed to contain the smell. That's why the cadaver dogs could not find the body. It would take 2 full days to complete the excavation of Paul's body, and Paul would be handed off to the coroner. The next day, Detective Birch would go to the coroner's office to find out the cause of death. The coroner would determine the cause of death to be gunshots, and would hand Detective Birch a .22 caliber round that appeared unusual. The bullet was longer than a normal .22 caliber, so Detective Birch would reach out to a friend of his that worked at the FBI as a firearms examiner, and the friend would tell Detective Birch the bullet was fired out of a silencer. The case started to look bulletproof against Daryl Cule, and the police would receive a call from a woman that said Daryl Cule had given her a briefcase and claimed to work for the CIA. Daryl would tell this woman to throw the briefcase into a landfill, and the woman would do as instructed. The police would start the daunting task of looking for the briefcase that has been in the landfill for months. It would appear that Lady Luck was on their side, because on the second scoop, they would pull out the briefcase. Inside the briefcase, they found a CIA training manual with a fake ID and a fake badge. Daryl Cule was a con man and an opportunist, and he found what he thought was the perfect victim. Paul was known for going out of town very frequently, so Daryl would take the opportunity to kill Paul and slither his way into Paul's bank account. The theory of what happened is Paul walked in on Daryl Cule taking things and was subsequently shot and wrapped in the waterbed mattress and dragged down the stairs to the basement and buried in the crawl space. After Daryl's crimes were done, he would meticulously clean Paul's home and cover up the bullet grooves in the floor by gluing down a small rug at the doorway of the home. With all the evidence piling up against Daryl Cule, a warrant is issued for the arrest of Daryl and is executed in Tacoma, Washington. The police were on high alert with guns drawn, but there was no incident in taking Daryl into custody. Daryl would invoke his right to remain silent, so Detective Birch would ask one of Daryl's sons if he had ever seen his father with a silenced weapon, and all of the color would run out of the boy's face, and he would begin to stumble over his words. The boy's mother would very aggressively look at the boy and say, "Well, tell him." So the boy would tell Detective Birch, "Yeah, I have seen my father with a silenced weapon. It's in a briefcase in his car." Daryl Cule was extradited back to Idaho, and on May 1st, 1997, Daryl would stand trial for the murder of Paul Gruber. Daryl would show no emotions while on trial. He had no defense and no evidence to prove his innocence. Daryl wanted what Paul had without wanting to do any of the work. He would let his greed take control and destroy not only his life, but the life of his kids and the lives of Paul's family. Daryl Cule was found guilty for first-degree murder, grand theft, and forgery, and was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. This case just goes to show you can never judge a book by its cover. Daryl was a church-going man who had businesses of his own, but these things would just appear to be a cover for the greed of man and the weakness that this man clearly had towards the love of material things. Let me know what you think down in the comments.